Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and RF, and we really appreciate you joining us on the show today. One of the things that we try to do on the show is talk about perspective and making sure that we're providing relevant content and useful information.
Yep.
And Mike, I'm sure you'll agree that lately we've been talking about patterns and trends, and we've been seeing how growth is affecting price and all sorts of things that cause people to pause and think about what their future looks like, whether it's for themselves or for the next generation. And part of planning really is understanding the data and understanding really where we are, but putting things in perspective. For example, how did the housing market a year ago or 2 years ago, well, does it matter? How did it affect where we are today in our decision making? And I think one of the things that I'd like to do just to start the show off today, because we're gonna talk about size, and we're gonna talk about the size from a couple of perspectives, Mike, both in terms of our personal habits and housing choices, but also in terms of, well, where we live and the community that we live and the growth of the community. But before we get into that, let's actually touch on some of the numbers that have come in recently.
Because
Go ahead,
data,
Mike.
I mean, there's a play between the emotional and the human components that influence what's happening in the real estate market, what's happening. But directly tied to that is the numbers and the data. So it's a good place to start. And the numbers are in for the previous month. So I'm going to have to read it right off the screen because I can't memorize all these numbers. But what we have, and I'll just run through them quickly, is the benchmark price for a single-family home last month, and well, carrying through into this month was $986,000. That's a substantial gain of 37.5% over last year, if you can believe that. The benchmark price for a townhouse row house unit was $696,900, an advance of 38.5%, and the benchmark condo unit price was $563,100. That was up by 44.2% over a year ago. So more people are focusing on those condo purchases now. That's driving up demand, which is in turn driving up the prices. So over
Mike,
last year.
I want to touch on something though. I remember doing this show in 2017. That puts a couple of years on this, or looking at the numbers from 2017.
About 160 shows ago, yes.
Looking at the numbers from 2017 and going, this will never happen again, is what a lot of people were thinking, that the sky is falling and the housing prices are up and it's crazy and I'll never be able to get in the market. And that was a year where we saw anywhere between 22 and 32% year-over-year increases in the price of housing. Fast forward, people saying, I'm going to wait wait it out because this can't sustain, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll get in when the housing.
This has never happened
corrects.
before. This will never happen again.
And here we are.
Which ties into our show, I guess.
Here we are. You're reading us numbers of 37.5% year-over-year increases. Apparently.
No, I know, and that's just from this year, from last year. It was a similar rise or increase between 2020 and 2019.
Yeah, I just want to put things into perspective though, Mike. I really do.
Yeah, and there were 933 new listings that came on board over the course of the previous month. And on average, they sold in no more than 7 days, many of them in less than 7 days. There were 254 units sold in the Barrie area last month, and on average they sold for 17% above their list price. So if they listed for $1 million, let's say, they sold for $1,170,000. Things are still going to bidding wars. Things are still selling above the list price. The talk about a calming market being on the horizon, it's coming, and we're starting to see signs of it in the higher end priced homes now. And as interest rates, I think another jump in interest rates, we just had one recently, which I don't think had a tremendous impact on the activity or enthusiasm. Another one, though, may start to calm that market a little bit.
I want to throw in a little bit of perspective as well here, though, Mike, and that is that, first of all, what the numbers that you're seeing are not unique to Barrie. They're not unique to Simcoe County. The reality, however, though, is that there are some more unique elements or factors of this region compared to other areas of the province or the country. And that is the fact that we have proximity to the GTA. That is the fact that we are on a 400 series highway, which matters to both commuters. We obviously have mass transit and rail transit, but it also matters from a logistics perspective for manufacturing as well as the industrial purposes. So the reality is that the area where we are here, the numbers are a little bit different. They are a little bit, I don't want to call it unique, but they are a little bit higher than the norm if you were to travel west or east. Well,
they are because of that influence. And at no time in the past has that influence been as relevant over our real estate, that being the GTA, been over us. As it has been in the past few years. If you go back 10, 15 years, we pretty much operated as a separate entity from GTA real estate. Now, all the driving factors that are pushing prices up here, when you trace them back, it's those GTA areas. Not just GTA, it's the greater Golden Horseshoe, which is literally from Oshawa around to south of Hamilton. There's 7 to 9 million people there, and a good number of them, when they're thinking, hey, it's time to buy a house or it's time to downsize, they're looking north. And it's that term we keep using over and over, the drive to a qualified crowd, that are looking on realtor.ca and going, I've got X number of dollars to spend, I can buy this much house here. If I go a little bit further now, I can buy that much more house. And Barrie's kind of a sweet spot in terms of physical distance from the GTA for those who are going to need to commute, and in terms of bang for the buck. So
the reality for me, though, Mike,
it's a great place to live.
It is a great place to live, and I think that is something that we've been talking about for the last several months for sure, is that as long as people in other major urban centers, whether it's the Toronto area, aka the GTA, or whether it's they're migrating from other major cities, they're going to realize that there is charm, there is beauty, there is opportunity outside of the GTA that is not available there, and more bang for buck, as you call it. So one of the questions, though, that actually our producer came and asked us, which was, does Barrie ever become eventually part of Toronto or part of the GTA? And you've been referencing the Golden Horseshoe, the greater Golden Horseshoe. What's the difference other than the name? Is this area becoming more and more part of the GTA?
Yeah, it's hard for us to grasp that concept, but if you look at cities that are more mature than Toronto, even going outside of North American cities, go to some European cities where there's populations in the multiple millions that have been evolving for 500 to 1,000 years versus our 150 to 200 years here for most cities. They have swallowed up a lot of outlying regions. Toronto alone, I mean, you go back to when my father was a kid in Toronto, he lived in a community called Mount Dennis, which was, for all intents and purposes, considered a separate entity from Toronto. It's completely swallowed up.
Mike, when I lived in Toronto myself, I lived in Thornhill when I grew up in Thornhill, but literally we went through that mega city. I think that was under Mel Lastman, if I remember correctly, but it was Toronto versus Scarborough versus maybe long-term.
North York versus Toronto. And now they're
it's just one.
You can't,
amalgamation.
And if you recall, we were talking about this when they built Wonderland back when we were a little bit younger. It's about 30 years old now, I guess. I think most people thought we would drive down to Toronto on the 400 highway, and they were building this big Disney World complex in the middle of nowhere. You were still, miles and miles away from Toronto. Why are you building this way out here? Well, obviously they had the foresight to see
that's the word
what was coming.
Thinking. Foresight, yeah.
And we've encroached on a lot of our agricultural land and rural, land. Up to a point, there were decisions made 10, 15 years ago that enough is enough. We need to start building up more intensity within cities rather than spreading. I think it makes sense. It has its impacts with regards to price and the type of home, and that's precisely what we're talking about here today.
So let's actually get into that just a little bit, though, because one might reasonably ask, Is there no plan? Why is this happening? It seems like it's all just starting to blend together. Again, I mentioned to you, our area is not unique in that regard. When I lived in Los Angeles, I got a bit of a history lesson, and it used to be 7 different municipalities, whether it was sort of Los Angeles proper and Santa Monica and Pasadena, Glendale, all those
Where
areas.
I lived in Thousand Oaks was a separate
You lived
city
in
unto
California
itself.
as well. And you know, you fly into LAX and you can see the city. It just goes on forever. There is
Before
no
you even
defined
start to
area.
descend, there's city underneath you.
We seem to think that that sort of the autonomy and separating sort of jurisdictions, if you will, geographically must include a farmer's field in between, and that's how you identify one boundary to the next. I don't want to diminish anybody's perspective on that, but I think that is an age-old thought process that you're going to, you know when you're leaving one area and going into another. But I do believe that there is some planning in here, whether we like it or not, whether we all happen to appreciate that planning thought process or not is, I'm not going to call it irrelevant. It is clearly, it's a difference of perspectives. But if you look at it, what we talked about being that 400 corridor, for example, I anticipate that we will start to see the gaps between Barrie and Innisfil and Bradford and Newmarket start to fill in
along the corridors.
I do hope that they keep an eye on the agricultural.
Well, you
area
have to watch because
in
we
Holland
do.
Landing, but
We do have some of the richest and most productive agricultural lands just on the perimeters of the urban center of Greater Toronto area.
Sure.
That needs to be protected. We also have the Oak Ridges Moraine, which is environmentally protected lands, and that's part of the influence with Barrie. If the natural progression was just to keep encroaching on that land in Toronto, Barrie probably wouldn't be seeing as high a demand as we do. But there's a leapfrog effect because there's all that protected band in between Barrie and Toronto. So Barrie is the next progression.
Sure. But what I do believe from an economic standpoint, and I mean economic, I don't mean profit-taking standpoint, but simply the logic behind how we build. I do think that we will continue to see, and I do believe that the planners who are Ontario-wide provincial planners versus municipal planners versus local planners, I do believe that they will continue to focus along building along the 400 corridor. We're seeing growth start to happen in Springwater, or more growth continue to happen in Springwater,
Innisfil,
which we will start to see that blur between the city boundary around the municipality of Barrie versus Springwater. ESSA will see something similar, and so will Innisfil. We got just a second.
And that growth will be to the south. I asked at one time a planner, how come we're not expanding to the west? And I'm told that those are all aggregate lands that border Barrie when you're going to the west. They're protected for that reason. Their value lies in their mineral content there. Going south towards the Innisfil Beach Road exit there, that corridor, it's already, we're seeing it being developed. You've had a behind-the-scenes look
I have.
because you've been city council. Well, when we come back, you asked the question, how far ahead do we plan, and do we plan well enough?
Absolutely. Well,
So
great segue. Absolutely. So stay with us for more of this on Hitting Home with Mike and Arf, and we're going to take it to another level. We're going to talk about how this affects the actual home and decision-making around homes, as well as city planning, when we come back on the other side of the break. Stay with us for more Hitting Home with Mike and Arf. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're talking about growth, the natural growth of populations, and it's something you and I have talked about a lot, as how the demand and supply are related, and how housing prices that we're seeing and climbing housing prices are directly tied to that need for more supply. But I thought I'd ask you the question, being a former city councilor here who's seen a little bit behind the scenes, aside from that obvious need, social need for more housing, does a city in and of itself, how important is that growth to the economic survival or the economic growth of a municipality? Is there a lot of focus on that from that perspective?
Oh, Mike, I think it's a great question, and I do think that there is a ton of focus on it. I think regardless of any political influence, if you will, in terms of, if you will, a 4-year strategic plan that a mayor and council might roll out as their priorities and objective. I think always working behind the scenes is that continuity or that continuation of a larger or a secondary plan, because that plan has been rolled out by a province, for example, the provincial mandate.
Has carte blanche over that longer-term plan for municipalities, am I right?
Right. So put things into perspective. The Municipal Act is a subset of provincial legislation. The province delegates some authority for localized municipalities to carry out certain duties. And so municipalities are, in a certain essence, responsible to provide the province with a plan, and a plan that the province approves in terms of how a city shall manage its duties, as well as how a city shall manage growth. So a number of years ago, before this current council that is sitting here today and before the next one, the province had already laid out a plan for growth in the province. So now, with that in mind, though, the question is, well, what's the motivation, or what is the motive behind it? And that motive is that a certain number of years ago, as planners and as legislators became aware of or privy to better collection of data and better understanding of the data that was collected, we collectively realized that we weren't building municipalities intelligently. We weren't building them.
We just began paying more attention to it.
Yeah, we weren't building them sustainably. No. Basically, anybody who had a plot of land could decide to put a for sale sign on it and sell it to a developer and put houses.
And there's got to be a lot of factors there. I would think certainly environment plays an important part in that.
Sure.
More so today than was given consideration 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
Economically, I mean, to put the infrastructure in place to house 100,000 people is a lot cheaper to do it within an existing urban center than to put it out the other side of Horseshoe Valley or something like that.
Right. So again, putting some things in a little bit of perspective. Okay, municipalities collect revenue from a few different sources. One of the sources is our property taxes, and that's what we're most familiar with. And the property taxes are about running the operations of a city and maintaining or keeping things sustainable, if you will. Additionally, we collect things through user fees, and user fees could be the use of water. It could be a partial contribution towards transit or partial contribution to rec centers. But in terms of the actual infrastructure below ground within a city, that is typically collected at the time of development charge, when the shovel goes in the ground. And then what happens, we collect those once, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but what happens in 20, 30, and 50 years when the roads need to be rebuilt? What happens when the infrastructure starts to crumble? And so what we learned as a municipality, and I'm sure this is widespread across the world at this point, is that building something here and then building something there isn't sustainable, because while you're collecting taxes in that local area, who's connecting that bridge in between those two areas?
And who's responsible?
And the answer was nobody. And so the answer was the infrastructure started to fail, and somehow it needed to get paid for. So whether we love it or not, it is a more responsible, it is determined to be a more responsible approach to build things a little bit closer. So those of us who want land and space between ourselves and our neighbors really kind of need to consider moving to an area that has no plans for development for the next 30 years. You asked a question about how are we planning down the road, and we are looking at 2035. We're looking at 2050, if not even beyond that, in terms of how we build.
Which is good to see, because I think you can go back to a point where municipalities and provincial level governments didn't think much further than 1 or 2 terms beyond where they were standing at that time. Now they're taking the long-term perspective, because they didn't have to. I mean, you know, after World War II, when a lot of the development and growth and infrastructure was put in place, we were 20, 30 years away from having to worry about it. It's like you buy a new house. You're not saving the next day for that roof you're going to have to replace. You should be, but we usually wait the 15 to 20 years until we're told, hey, we need a new roof.
Well, it's funny, Mike, you say that, and I'm going to switch gears completely just for a second, then we'll come back to it. But when my clients are talking to me about, do I buy a detached home, which is freehold, or do I buy into a condo, which is not freehold? There's a condo fee, association fee towards that. Which one's better? And, well, condo fees cost more. Well, the reality is, actually, no, it doesn't necessarily, because you're paying into some common element fees, and you're paying
There's
condo
a reserve
fees
fund there. Yeah.
because somebody beyond you is actually forecasting and budgeting and planning for the eventual replacement of the roof, the windows, and any other upkeep that is necessary. If you own your own home, you're responsible for doing that yourself.
Essentially, you have a financial planner working on your behalf.
So similarly, though, bringing it back to municipal planning in general, whether you like the current mayor and or council, and whether you agree with some of their personal ideologies or policies or priorities, is kind of irrelevant. The reality is that if we don't pay attention to the data, we are all in trouble. And so this is that where that comes into, like, knowledge is power, and it's knowledge applied is power. So they're using the data better.
Here's a hypothetical, but do you think a city could decide, you know what, we're as big as we need to be or want to be? Because there's a significant portion of the public, if you ask them, they say, yeah, we don't want to grow any bigger. We like the size of our city. We like the quaintness, whatever, of our town the way it is. It's bigger than we ever want it to be, and we want to stop growing. Does a municipality, first of all, have the ability and capability to limit that and put a limit on it? And does it make any sense for them to do it?
Well, I'm going to be reaching into my memory just a little bit, Mike, but I do remember that certainly during my 2 seasons, if you will.
Your tenure?
On my tenure, yes, on council. Coming up with an official plan was definitely on our agenda, and we were being heavily influenced, if not prodded, if you will, by the provincial counterparts to come up with a plan. And so I would suggest that there was as much delay and sort of procrastination's maybe not the right word. It's, nobody wants to be the one to make the mistake, so sometimes we just strike another committee for the sake of striking another committee so that we can talk about it some more, so that eventually someone will come up with a good idea. And the reality is that it's never popular to raise fees. It's never popular to have to bite the bullet. It's, I don't want to call it politically, detrimental to your political future. The reality is, though, that while possibly extreme, the province had the power to say, if you don't do it, we'll do it for you, and then we will force it upon you. And what would have happened then is that the city, locally here, would have had to carry out the bidding of someone making a decision down at Queen's Park, and we would have lost that autonomy. So obviously that was a catalyst for councillors at the time saying, okay, we better focus. Right? So
it is inevitable from every perspective that a city, and this city, the city of Barrie, is going to continue to grow. And the projections are we are going to hit somewhere around 250,000 by 2030, 2035.
Sure.
I may be off a little bit on those, but
And the reason why I say sure is that these were projections, and because of certain political seasons, certain economic seasons, obviously COVID didn't necessarily help. Some things got delayed. We are still definitely trending towards that number. There might be a little bit of a slowdown or a hiccup, if you will, in the plan, and then suddenly the next year or two later, there's a bit of a catch-up that happens. So overall, though, if you're looking on the daily, you're not doing yourself a justice if you actually step back and look at the actual trends over a larger period of time.
It's a big boat.
You'll see that
Takes
we're
a long
trending
time
towards
to turn.
And here's the reality, Mike. We talked about it before on a previous show, and that is that nothing operates independently. So what the city's doing here locally does impact what our neighbors are doing and how they're able to do it, because we do share services with the county. We have roads that connect beyond our sort of our boundary, right? That connect into others, and so there needs to be some cooperation with our
And they play a role
neighbors.
in the economics and decision making of our development and our growth too.
Absolutely.
Beyond what a lot of people would even be aware, I would think, given what I see when I look at some of the comments on news postings there when there's a new project being announced. But let's bring it down to that more personal level, a little closer to the individual here, and keeping with the theme of size that we have here for this show. As we develop, and it is inevitable that we're going to continue to grow, we are more or less forced. I don't like to use the word forced, but I encouraged just basically because of the amount of space that's left. There isn't a lot of buildable residential land that's untouched within the built boundaries of Barrie. We're lucky enough to acquire some land, the decision that was made many years ago and is now being developed south of Barrie. That's rare for any municipality in Ontario to have new developable untouched land to build on in the scope and scale that we have here in Barrie.
Right.
But within the built boundaries, there's a lot of focus on intensity. You can't build out anymore, we're building up. So just by default, houses are becoming living accommodations, smaller and smaller units. Just want to talk a little bit about that. Do you think
Sure.
the public will have no choice but to adapt to that if they want to build or buy brand new going forward? Of course, the resale bigger homes are still there, but there's a price component to owning one of those as well versus one of the newer, smaller. So
Sure.
what are some of
All
your
you have
thoughts
to
there?
do, Mike, all you have to do is hop in the car, take a drive around the area. And remember, we were talking off the top of the show, we were talking about sort of different cities that started to blend together and amalgamate to make a bigger city. Well, if you look at the city of Barrie itself, for example, it wasn't the city of Barrie right off the top. There were a number of different villages, towns, hamlets, if you will, that eventually grew into each other to
Became
become
part of Barrie.
the part
Holly
of the
was
city of
separate
Barrie.
from Barrie, Painswick.
Holly, Allendale, Painswick, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, while in our lifetime we've become accustomed to what we thought, what was comfortable, if you will, the idea that we got comfortable with, change has already happened, and it's happened over the past, 150 years and beyond, right? But get in your car today and drive through the different neighborhoods, and you will see the different built forms, the different housing styles and housing types. There are areas that you might refer to as, built with vet homes, for example, or much smaller cottage style. And so, we're not going to have time to get into this. We're going to have to go to break in just a second. But if you will, get used to and get comfortable with the idea. And it's nice. My kids used to play games in terms of guessing as we drove through different neighborhoods, what era or what decade certain neighborhoods really sort of took shape and took form. Now, as we drive along some of the major arteries, or if you look into some of the different areas and neighborhoods, you'll start to see that a term that we haven't used too much on this show, but we talk about land assembly. So if you drive down Yonge Street, anywhere between Little and Big Bay Point, you'll see a series of homes that all have one realtor's name on the sign, et cetera. And they did an assembly. You can anticipate what's going to come next. They're all going to get knocked down, and they're all going to get rebuilt and redesigned to be more appropriate. On the other side of the break, which we really have to go to now, let's talk about that for a second in terms of the changing face of the municipality, why that happens, why it's inevitable, why we might as well get used to it and have input into how to make it the best we can, as opposed to just complain about what someone else is doing, right?
Very good. Let's do it.
So we do have to go to break, but stay with us. This is fun. We're going to talk about, when we come back from the break, housing forms and different styles that I think we're going to get used to, and then we'll also wrap it up with what the city can do to influence that change. But stay with us on the other side of the break with more from Mike and me on Hitting Home.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and the focus today is on size of cities, size of the homes we live in, and that. And there definitely is a trend, an evolution, we could call it, towards smaller living units, and it's partly because of the lack of available land for new builds. So we're not building the big, 150-foot deep by 60-foot wide lots with detached homes so much inside of cities. We're seeing land assemblies, as you mentioned before the break, where older homes on some of those bigger lots that were built in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they're being assembled, those homes coming down, and we're seeing multi-units going up. Now, there's still, to this day, a stigma around multi-residential among those neighboring detached homeowners. And you see it almost every time at City Council when there's deputations being given, people getting their opportunity to voice their thoughts on that proposal that's coming in. And without a doubt, you're going to see the person who comes up, or multiple people come up and say, this is going to bring crime to our area, this is going to make our streets unsafe. And I'm sorry, I coming from, you know, the time I spent in Toronto, we didn't look at multi-residential as necessarily as crime havens or you know, incubators for you know, ill will. These were where the upwardly mobile people chose to live. And I think that's who's moving into these places up here, is the upwardly mobile, young families, people who are ambitious and moving on. There may have been a time when those multi-residential units were first introduced to Barrie, where most of them were bought up by speculators and investors who in turn rented them out. So you didn't have that pride of ownership in those communities. But that's really changed today.
Yeah, Mike, you know, it's funny, whenever I hear these deputations, and, you know, I smile because I say it with love and I say it with appreciation, I say it with empathy, but at the end of the day, those arguments are absolutely
And with tongue
nonsense.
firmly planted in cheek.
Yeah, there's usually a cold sore, a canker sore, or some bleeding happening inside my mouth, but the reality is that those arguments are absolutely nonsense, and I'm just going to put it in perspective. When was the last time that you walked into a parking garage where you were the only person in the entire parking garage? How safe did you feel, or were you checking your surroundings, right? Walking in a lonely stairwell or something like that, you probably had your awareness was heightened. You probably were wondering who's behind you, et cetera. When was the last time you walked into a parking garage where it had 20, 30 people and cars driving in and out all over the place? You didn't have, I have to believe you didn't have that same sort of spine-tingling, you know, sense of nerves, et cetera.
Yeah.
The reality is that having more people present in a downtown core or in any area, if you're walking through a park at night and there's either a light on or no lights on, but if there's 10, 20, 30 people who are enjoying the summer, you know, there is a feeling of calm and safety and security because you're surrounded by your neighbors versus walking through that same area all dark and
I agree with
by
you.
yourself. So it's psychological, and the reality is that that argument doesn't hold water.
And I'd like to believe that there's a certain element of theater to that. You basically have a group of people who are uncomfortable with the idea of a new development in their area, so they'll play up that
They're reaching
aspect.
for any reason that they can find to make it. Now the reality is that the City of Toronto and other major urban centers have proven how not to build social housing. They've proven how not to build these
That lesson was learned
settings.
25 years ago.
Oh, longer than 25,
35.
if not plus years ago, absolutely. So community housing has itself had to change. But by the very definition, congregate setting in itself is not dangerous. It doesn't breed sort of negative elements and drug abuse and whatever else it might be. It builds community, in fact, is what it does. But here's the difference. I mean, you brought up a good point. When you look at those areas where we were in this city, certainly 30, 40, 50 years ago, building many detached homes with large properties, that was when we didn't have the same value or appreciation for land. And when I say value and appreciation, I don't mean we didn't respect the land. It means it wasn't in as tight supply. So suddenly that commodity is that much more scarce.
And if we needed more, we just moved the boundaries out a little bit further and a little bit further.
Exactly, absolutely. But also what was built back then was considered right for the time. The times have changed.
They have.
And so has technology, and so has our understanding of how to build homes. Anything that we're doing today, by the way, was already pre-designed probably in Asia and Europe at least 20, 30 years ago,
Well,
if not
they
far
confronted
beyond that.
these issues a long time ago.
When you're on an
They're new to
island,
us.
when you're on an island and it's a small island, you know that you don't have a lot of land to work with, so you use it sparingly, right? So we have taken it a little bit for granted, the size of land mass that we have. But now, as I said in the last segment, that we have access to data and those numbers, and we understand how unsustainable the previous practices were, now we're starting to appreciate it more. Here's the interesting thing, though, about the topic of changing sort of built form or housing styles and types. I was just down in IKEA yesterday. I had to pick up a light, and I don't even know what they call it.
Allen key?
Yeah, I had to pick up exactly. And they've got these setups now, these displays, if you will, as you're walking through the maze, and you can see what a condo might look like, for example.
Yeah.
And they had this one display that was set up to scale, and it was 597 square foot condo that had a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and a balcony in it.
Yeah.
And the way that they did
595 square foot.
597, don't shortchange
Okay.
it, all right?
All right. that those 2 feet are important when you're talking.
At that point, they
Yes.
really are. But the way that they designed the use of space was phenomenal. Was I, itching to get in and buy myself one? Not necessarily.
But you can't help but look at it and go, I could do this.
I absolutely appreciated
Yeah.
it. The way that they made use of every corner, the way that they had the right furnishings or furniture, or what do you want to call it, like finishes, stackable laundry systems,
The
and all that
Murphy
kind of stuff.
bed that folds down, and
It was
then becomes
amazing.
a table, and
The reality is, though, Mike, we are going to go there because we're all talking about housing affordability. We're talking about how the next generation is actually going to make it or not. And we brought up on a recent show about the fact that we personally thought, or at least I know I did, and I'm pretty sure you did as well, thought that the approach to home ownership might change. You might be getting in with a sibling or getting in with a best friend. Speak to the lawyer, obviously, get some good guidance and advice around making sure that you respect each other, whether there's a fallout or whether things run smoothly. Irrelevant, have a good contract and understanding between each other, but you're either going to have to change your approach to home ownership, or you're going to have to change your approach to home ownership.
And it's a conversation I often have with would-be home buyers when I first sit down with them, and I emphasize this to them, is that first home you buy, it's a transitional home. It's that first rung on the ladder. There's still a mindset. You used to be able to buy your first home and still be living in it in 20 years because it still served the purpose. Realistically today, that home that's going to serve your needs 20 years from now is likely out of your affordability range today as a first-time young home buyer. You're going to buy into that IKEA-style 500 to 1,000 square foot condo unit, and you may live there 5 to 10 years. So I think transition is something we're still adapting to here, and we're going to see it more and more, because those bigger detached homes, the Allendale homes, the East End Barrie homes, who's living in them predominantly today? It's people who've mostly empty nesters who have raised their kids. Their kids are adults now in their own places, but those homes will transition. And so there's people coming in at this end and people going out at that end. And there's a natural cycle to home ownership. I know there's a certain element of that that's hard to appreciate, but it's
a reality. It's a reality. And so, Mike,
there's a cycle.
One of the sort of mottos or philosophies that we have in our business is about getting uncomfortable, embracing change, get uncomfortable, get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. And I think you're exactly touching on that. I do personally believe, and I'm quite okay with it, because of the data, because of the ingredients. It makes sense that we embrace some different approaches to it. So we should be building homes that match the need, that match the demand. We can't talk out of both sides of our mouth. But I also think that there could be some fun, that if we were to build homes that better suited our needs. For example, right now, if you take a sort of a 10,000 foot view of our neighborhoods in North America in general, you will see sort of every other home or whatever has a basketball net out front. Every other home has a swimming pool, or 1 in 5 homes maybe has a swimming pool.
A lot of redundancy there.
A lot of redundancy happening. And if you look at the fact that certainly fuel costs are up, grocery costs are up, the cost of living is up. Yet for some reason we all still think that I need to buy something for myself, and I'm going to pull into my driveway, drive into my garage, shut the door behind me, not wave to my neighbor, go to my basement, sit in front of my TV, get on my video game or whatever it may be. Like that's sort of the picture that I have. Everybody sort of lives in their own, fenced in yards built by HD and with the what do you call the tight board fencing, et cetera. If we actually were to think about, how about going a different approach? And how about building communities whereby we can not open a pool, use the pool maybe once a week on a weekend, and then close the pool and have all that wasted energy, have that all wasted space, have all that concrete in our backyard. But if we actually started building neighborhoods and building subdivisions.
More the condominium concept.
If the development community, if the building community started building neighborhoods differently, and again, you can take this any way you want. And certainly, I think when we come back to round out the show, we're going to talk about some things. I want to plant the seed right now about what can municipalities do a little bit differently, but what can we as individuals demand differently than we have in the past?
Well, that's in its infancy. I think we're still getting our head around the whole concept of, firstly, building those more intense communities. Now we're looking at, well, how can we make these better? How can we utilize this? What opportunities and advantages are there? And you touched on one. There's no need for everybody to have a pool if they're only using it for 2 hours a week. And I think that same mindset is going to, in time, apply to automobiles. Instead of each of us owning our own individual car that we drive once or twice, there's Uber. But I have a feeling once we have autonomous cars, you'll just call up the car, so the car's going to show up.
I'm going to call Iron Man.
Yeah.
But so here's the reality. We're already doing these things. First of all, what we're talking about now isn't foreign.
No.
It's new. We already have condominiumized settings. We already have communities. We've already got rec centers.
Yeah. But we're not applying them
We're not applying it to the maximum potential that we could. So why not? But you're absolutely right, Mike. We already do ride sharing. We already do bicycle sharing. We do lots of things that we share.
Communities that are close to, in proximity to, or adjacent to the water oftentimes have a deeded beach that's accessible only to them.
But think about that word that you just said, Mike, and we talk about it socially, we talk about it ethically, we talk about it, we want to combat the idea of discrimination, we want to combat racism, we want to talk about building stronger communities, we want to talk about things like collaboration, we talk about economies of scale, we talk about all sorts of things, yet are we actually applying these principles to the fullest capacity?
No. And I think we've gone in the opposite direction in the last 30 years or so, and here's where I see that. The individual home design, we went from having a detached garage to the side or to the back of the house to putting the garage right in front. That was what you saw. So no longer do you have a big covered front porch on most homes built in the last 40 years. Everybody went into their backyard. They never saw their neighbors out walking down the street. So if you go into older neighborhoods, there's more of a sense of community just from the simple fact that people go for walks at nights and they see their neighbors sitting out on their front porch. We did away with front porches 30, 40 years ago and replaced them with giant 2-3 car garages out the front. So we need to change our built form in order to facilitate a change in community.
Well, I think what we need to do, absolutely, Mike, is we need to start doing exactly all the things that we've been idealizing and talking about.
Yeah.
So I think when we come back on the other side of the break, let's talk about, well, what we think municipalities themselves could do as urban planners, municipal planners. What can they do to help guide us and catalyze us to actually doing these things that we've set up as priorities? So stay with us for more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arf. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and RFN. Mike, it is an interesting question. It is a fascinating question of whether size itself does matter. We've been covering that about whether it's the size of a municipality or the amount of population growth that we have, or how we work with that, and the size of the actual home that we end up living in, or dwelling that we end up living in. And Mike, and I think you rightly referenced the fact that there still is this sort of a burning desire in people to have a detached home, and you're referencing in the middle of the show,
the home you grew up in, the home your grandparents had that you visited that seemed to have an endless backyard. There's still a longing for that, I think, for all of us here. But it's we just revealed at the beginning of the show that housing prices, detached home prices are, 37% over this time last year. So that dream of that detached home is getting pushed a little further and further down the street as time goes on. So it's not going to be, for most people, the first home you buy. It's going to be maybe the next or the next one after that. And again, like we talked about, I think we need to change our mindset about our housing. You get comfortable rather than uncomfortable with the idea of moving every now and again. Well, people who do it often get excited about it. I see it.
And again, remember, whether it's the city that's evolving or we as humans are evolving within our life and our life cycle, generationally, if you will, or through the family cycle, etc., our needs our needs do change and should change. And by the way, if you're living in the exact same home, for over 50 years, maybe you didn't quite maximize on the opportunity not to buy and sell and flip and put appreciation or equity into your pocket, but live in a setup, in a dwelling that best served the different stages of your life.
Exactly.
So we did have a guest on our show not so long ago, Nick Nanos, who's a pollster, and he definitely has his finger on the pulse of Canadians and Canada in general, not only politically, but also sort of what people want and demand and expect from government, if you will. And you're right, he did say that there was a strong will or leaning towards home ownership,
when the
that
question
detached
was
home
asked,
ownership.
People prefer it, but the reality is, again, it's not the first home you're going to buy.
Absolutely, and the question also came up during the past couple of years regarding, well, now that there is this thing called a pandemic, how does that influence our decision making? And certainly the demand for single detached homes would have gone up as well, and really, if you will, the reservation around congregate setting and congregate living went up as well. I still think we're going to go that direction. I still think that we're going to put this one behind us, and all you have to do is look around. People can't wait to wave at each other, see each other. They're smiling. And the thing that really got me, Mike, was I keep thinking about all the people that you look, whether it's on social media or you talk to your neighbor, your family member. People can't wait to get away. They're looking to go south. And when they go south, it's pretty much 9 out of 10 people are booking a reservation for a week at a place where they are surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of other people living in close quarters. They're living in, I don't want to say tiny, but they're living in really small, tight-knit settings.
Less than 500 square feet.
Whether it's a hotel or whether it's a resort, sharing a swimming pool, sharing a restaurant, sharing the different amenities at a swim-up, poolside bar, whatever it may be. We're not thinking about it. We're not overanalyzing it, but this is actually what people are doing. It's what they're telling the world they want. It's what they're telling the world they're yearning for. What is the reason why we cannot have an and scenario where people who can afford and want and need a detached home can have one? But why aren't we looking at how we can best build communities? And that's the question I want to talk about just for the next couple of minutes. But what municipalities and municipal planners and private planners can do to work with their developers to speak to what it is that the people want. And there is an element of why can we not have shared recreation facilities, parks, playgrounds, et cetera? Yes, we have them in the middle of neighborhoods, but do we have them to the extent, and are we utilizing them by design, much like IKEA was showing us in their sort of planned out spaces? Are we maximizing sort of our amenities and our communal living amenities to the best of our ability?
I'm confident that we are and will move in that direction, but the whole concept is in its infancy here, because again, you and I grew up in the detached home generation, and the generation before that, it was all about the detached home. It's only the current generation and partly the generation before, say 90s onward, where this focus on smaller units, multi-residential, urban living is becoming a greater and greater reality. And we're learning how, and we're, as a species here, humans, we design something and we stand back from it and go, how can we make this better and better and better? So, a generation from now, what we're going to see in multi-residential complexes will probably make the stuff that's being built today look boring by comparison. So
nothing that we're talking about on the show is absolutely far-fetched or foreign. I think we already have dipped our toe into many of those waters, whether it's community-based housing, whether it is condominiumized housing. Does it have to be a tall tower? Can it be a bunch of low-rise? Can it be walk-ups? Depending on where you are in your life and your physical capabilities or your other needs, I think that we're far from really tapping our brains in terms of maximizing on these innovative, that word that's a buzzword. Innovative. Are we being as innovative as we possibly could?
And I think aging in place is a far more doable concept within multi-residential than it is in the big detached home that needs all the work and
I
service.
personally see, and I think if you go to some of the southern states, you'll see it more because there's more outdoor
different parts
ability.
of the world are further ahead.
But I certainly see a trend going towards walk-ups, low-rise condos, townhomes, brownstones, row housing, that kind of thing, where you'll have communities, where you'll have walkable neighborhoods, where you have people with the local butcher, local convenience store, local baker, etc. You'll have reasons for people to gather on an outdoor patio. You'll have better playgrounds. You'll have better parks. You'll have better access to pickleball courts, etc. And it's not that it gets more expensive, and it's not even that it gets more expensive for the municipality. I think that if we're building our communities with that in mind, people will say, I'm going to spend less on what's mine. I'll be willing to pay a little bit more for what we share in a community basis, whether it's the developer that builds it or the city and the municipality that manages it. It's the same amount of money. In fact, it'll actually cost people less. And they'll just allocate some more funds for a manager of sorts, the private developer manager, property manager, or for the municipality to manage it on our behalf. But we'll actually get better use out of our dollars, is what I'm thinking.
And it isn't exactly a new concept. We've been doing this with secondary housing and recreational housing, timeshares, for quite some time. We've embraced that concept of shared facilities, shared everything in that realm for quite some time. And it's now bringing that into our mainstream living more and more. So again,
I think about and anybody who's curious and questioning, and by the way, you might absolutely disagree with me. You might hate everything I'm saying, and that's okay. I don't live in one of those settings either, but at this point in my life, I'm not opposed to it. My children, for the most part, are out of the home. They're in university. The older two are in university. My needs are going to change. I'm going to be able to, I want to be able to lock the door and leave and go take a trip to Asia or Europe or anywhere, the East Coast or the West Coast for that matter. So it's not a horrible idea to me. I'm actually willing. Now, I don't do it now, like I said, and I enjoy my privacy and I like having my own space, absolutely. But I think literally it comes down to, and I haven't designed it fully in my own head yet, but literally it's, am I making the best use of my resources, and can I share, and can I actually get added value if I'm willing to put in 50% and you're willing to put in 50% and somebody else is willing to put in 50%, we've now got 150%, whereas on my own I've got 100. Right?
And it works, and you like the concept, but at the end of the day, it's not one size fits all.
No,
when we're
absolutely
talking
not.
about size. And it's nice that there are varieties, there are options for everybody, but I think as we further embrace the multi-unit resident, therein lies the affordable housing opportunities, and therein lies an entry level into housing ownership that is existing less and less within the detached home model.
Well, and the reality is that when you build something that is detached, you have to build your own foundation, your own four walls, your own finishes. And when you have multi-unit, you're sharing a foundation. You might pay for your own 2 of 4 walls, but not necessarily 4 of 4 walls, and the cost is spread out.
Environmentally it's better, the carbon footprint is lesser. It's just a matter of us as humans in society getting our heads around this.
Absolutely. We have to wrap this one up, Mike. It's been a fantastic conversation. I might have just painted myself into my future on this show, but I think it was worth talking about.
Watch for shopping at IKEA next week.
Exactly. We got to go. We want to thank you for joining us on Hitting Home with Mike and Arf. We'll see you again.